Nothingness and the metaphysics of naked self-preservation. All primary hostilities can be derived from the splitting off of death from life. The inability of any modern, post-metaphysical, scientized thinking to conceive of any death as one's own leads to two obviously ubiquitous attitudes. Death does not belong to life, but confronts it irreconcilably, or even more disconnectedly, as an absolute annihilation. And because there is no death of which I can say it is mine, thinking clings to the only death that remains thinkable as an objective death, that of the other. Live and let die, as the title of a James Bond story says. The a priori principle of self-preservation, agent's cynicism, enjoys the freedom of being able to say it openly, functions according to this rule of thumb. Because the modern subject, for psychological, ideological and metaphysical reasons, cannot think its own death, against this Heidegger's philosophy seems, scheint, only an impotent corrective. It becomes subsumed under the law to avoid it with literally every means available. In a certain respect, all means are means for not dying. As a logical consequence of total instrumentalism, a total instrumentalism pervades everything that is not the ego, which wants to survive. It provides the technical logical basis for the modern ruler's cynicism of instrumental reason, quoting Horkheimer. If the subject is a priori that which cannot die, it transforms the world rigorously into the domain of its struggles for survival. What hinders me is my enemy. Whoever is my enemy must be hindered from hindering me. In its ultimate consequence, this will to prevention implies the willingness to annihilate the other, or the other, capital O, with the alternative them or us. The choice falls automatically on the death of the others, since it, in the case of conflict, is the sensible, necessary and sufficient condition of my survival. The incapacity to die subjects the world, in its visible as well as invisible areas, to a radical transformation. If, on the one hand, it becomes the theatre of human struggles for self-preservation, on the other it is flattened simultaneously into the materialist backdrop behind which only so-called nothingness can be surmised. What in earlier times constituted the knowledge of priests, shamans and mystics, insights and views into the beyond, into the sphere of spirits, angels, demons, powers, gods, now becomes impossible. Now becomes impossible, if only because we can no longer assume a stance to which such a beyond full of beings could be allotted. Only an ego that can die and go beyond itself, and that experiences itself as a being within a metaphysically expanded cosmos, would be able to communicate with the spaces and events beyond death, beyond the empirical body and everyday understanding. However, the modern self-preserving ego, which produces itself through mistrust, criticism, rationality and control, through universality, marks itself off from the start, from such individual metaphysical intercourse, from spiritual flights, night wanderings and journeys beyond limits. The ego without metaphysics, to be sure, presents itself as cognitively modest by demonstrating, a la Kant, that and why we cannot know of such things. However, precisely through this, it slides into an explosive self-expansion, because from this denial onward, it stands absolutely alone vis-à-vis the universe. Only with this does the modern self-preserving and knowing ego achieve world dimensions. Ego and world come to have the same extensionality. Where a world is asserted, the ego that has it as its subject, the ego that has it as its object must be designated. Only with the subject without metaphysics, and not earlier, can Nietzsche's diagnosis of a will to power be confirmed, for the subject of modern knowledge is explicitly megalomaniac. not in the sense of muddle-headed or exaggerated self-esteem, but in the sense of a collective, ontologically real plan of technical praxis, where the modern natural sciences and technologies have brought forth. Let me try that again. What the modern natural sciences and technologies have brought forth are palpable realizations of ideas that earlier were possible only as magic, metaphysical or occult ideas. Flights into space, deep-sea diving, world travel, telecommunications, robots, thinking machines, rejuvenation magic, genetics, psychopharmacology, nuclear energy, reception of radiation from outer space. All these are precipitates of a much earlier metaphysics, which, however, becomes real only through its retreat, and through the elimination of its most important psychic thread, the consciousness of my mortality, which ineluctably links me with the hidden and the beyond. In modern thinking, however, death is not the door to somewhere else, but a pure rupture, a node between being and nothingness, not between the here and the beyond. Since the disintegration of death, everything that is non-ego must become potentially the reality of an enemy. The polemical disciplines are called on to keep it in check. Since human beings in no respect could still think of themselves as partners of a beyond, their gaze has dimmed to the given world. Gloomily, humanity had to take every kind of given meaning from itself. Thus the nihilistic shock when one realizes that there is no given meaning, but that we manipulate it and then consume it ourselves. When things have gone so far, the ultimate wisdom in the middle of meaninglessness remains only blind self-preservation. But with this, the problem is not solved. To the extent that conventional images of transcendence were extinguished, hundreds of substitute transcendences spring out of the ground. In the middle of the process of enlightenment, and they were by no means in every case, as Gundolf once said of the spiritualist, merely fishing in the beyond. The concept of substitute transcendence could ground a phenomenology of modernity and order numerous phenomena into perplexing connections. The unconscious as an individual and collective immanent beyond. History as the sphere of dark origins or of bright future. The lost wealth or the promised fullness as that which gives and simultaneously takes our identity. Space travel as infantile, technological and military psychedelics. Eroticism as the maze where egos seek the you into which they could go over. Drugs as explosions of the banal continuum and journeys into interior outer worlds. The arts as the disciplines in which subjects can creatively climb into something they are not yet, into shapes, fantasies and expressions. Competitive sports as an attempt to overcome the daily limits of bodily movement and performance. Tourism as expansion of the world of experience. However, besides such transformations of transcendence, we could say, into an extended humanity, there is also in modernity a thoroughgoing revenge of the occult, precisely because no room was left in the world concept of enlightenment for the beyond. I'll say that again. Precisely because no room was left in the world concept of enlightenment for the beyond, i.e., there are no enigmas, only problems, no mysteries, only falsely formulated questions. Consciousness, which thus was left in the lurch, sought 1,000 secret paths into dark regions. Okay, I'll say that again without the parenthesis. Precisely because no room was left in the world concept of enlightenment for the beyond, consciousness, which thus was left in the lurch, sought 1,000 secret paths into dark regions. Respectable occultism is a typical product of enlightenment, and its representatives are parodies of scientists who, against the sceptical world, try to defend the beyond, which for them is a certainty, and this they do by means of precisely that scientific skepticism that only acknowledges facts. Of course, that cannot work well. but that it is attempted at all shows at least a perhaps strongly justified urge. Occultism is the too often humourless and cramped, drastic defence of metaphysical sensibilities against the exactions of a materialist backdrop ontology and of a repression of one's own death in favour of a falsely enlarged and falsely modest ego. Black metaphysics, border crossings between the psychotic and spiritual galaxies, black empiricism beyond empiricism. We can predict that these neo-mythical tendencies will increase. They are in reality the things that challenge what is traditionally called enlightenment. Enlightenment must be enlightened about what enlightenment dishes up. Catastrophic processes of forgetting follow enlightenment's triumphant learning processes like a shadow. Because enlightenment, with its irresistible anti-metaphysical thrust, has led to a polemical splitting off of death in the first person, it would today be apposite for it to go into the school of the opponent and to learn what is at stake when living beings experience themselves to be in alliance with powers that go about their affairs beyond the narrow and simultaneously puffed up world subjugating ego.